Okay, so here we have it. Lecture number 7, Introduction to Psychiatric Disorders. The absolute last lecture of the semester, so this is part A. So let's go ahead and we'll jump right in. Let's talk about what we're going to be discussing in this lecture. All right, so we'll go through and we'll do a brief introduction to sort of the background to the psychiatric disorders. Why are we so fascinated with the psychiatric disorders? You know, what is some of the history of the psychiatric disorders? How are they previously looked upon? How are they treated? How's that been modernized into a medicalized model of etiology or underlying causation that's actually applied throughout all of the clinical sciences now? Then we'll go ahead and after that, we'll discuss the anxiety disorders. Those have in 6 major types that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. We'll talk about panic disorder or panic attacks. We've mentioned those briefly in the past. We'll talk about phobias, or in other words, irrational fears that interrupt our ability to function. We'll talk about obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and we'll differentiate that from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. We'll talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We'll associate that with traumatic events in people's lives, like wars, unusual events, things like that. And then we'll briefly discuss, what are the underlying roots? How do we explain the anxiety disorders? And in particular, in that discussion, we'll talk about whether or not all anxiety disorders could be rooted in medical cause, or whether or not a lot of them have primarily more of the psychosocial causes. So we'll take that back to the biopsychosocial. All right. Then we'll move on. We'll talk about dissociative and personality disorders. In particular, we'll talk about dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder, as it used to be called. Then we'll move on and we'll talk about the mood disorders, 3 of those that I need you to understand: the major depressive disorder or unipolar depression. We'll talk about bipolar disorders, and of course we'll do a little explanation of the mood disorders as well. All right. After that, we'll talk about schizophrenia, one of my favorite topics, some of the more interesting of the psychiatric disorders. There's actually about 5 major types, subtypes of schizophrenia, but we're going to talk about it in a generalized way. So we'll talk about some symptoms, we'll talk about the onset and development of schizophrenia, and then we'll discuss how do we understand schizophrenia in terms of the biopsychosocial model. And then we'll finalize things by talking about the rates of psychological disorders across societies and across the world. All right, so let's start with this quote here. This is a gentleman named Mark. This is from an article from 1996, and Mark was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And the reason I include this here is that it just does a wonderful job of kind of illustrating, giving us insight into the mind of the individual that is suffering from mental illness. So let's read this. I felt the need to clean my room, would spend 4 to 5 hours at it. At the time, I loved doing it, then I didn't want to do it anymore, but I couldn't stop. The clothes hung 2 fingers apart. I touched my bedroom wall before leaving the house. I just had constant anxiety. I thought I might be nuts. So once again, why do we do this? It's an insight into a way a lot of these individuals feel. Now, a lot of times with things like schizophrenia, schizophrenia, by the way, means quite literally break from reality. These individuals aren't rooted in reality, and they don't understand what's going on with them. But a lot of times with the mental disorders, things like obsessive-compulsive disorder, the individual understands that they are strange. They understand that they're standing outside of what would be considered normal by society, and yet they can't break away from it, okay? Look what poor Mark says. He goes, at the time, so with OCD, he's got OCD here, he goes, at the time I loved doing it. And even then he realized that the obsessive-compulsive nature of his actions were just ridiculous, okay? The fact that he had to hang his clothes 2 fingers apart, that he had to touch the bedroom wall before leaving the house. And what does it do? It causes him constant anxiety. And even though he is suffering from a mental disorder, he uses a classic pop culture reference here. He goes, I thought I might be nuts. All right. So we have these mental illnesses, and yet, like I said, a lot of times the individuals that are suffering from them recognize that they're abnormal, but yet they just can't explain their own actions, and they can't step away from their own actions. Okay. Now, like I said, a lot of them, like schizophrenia, it is a total break from from society and it'll break from reality. But a lot of them are like Mark with his OCD diagnosis. All right, so let's move on here. If you think about it, think about television, think about movies, think about literature, okay? We're fascinated by the unusual. We're fascinated by abnormal situations, all right? We're fascinated by why people do things that don't fit within the normal realm of human experience, okay? And a lot of literature and a lot of movies and things like that, you can see that. A lot of the movies that come to theaters are a split from reality. They aren't something that you and I experience, okay? So, if they are not portrayals of reality, why are we fascinated by these things, okay? Well, it comes down to this. At various moments throughout our life, we all feel like we're the abnormal individual. We think we act different than the norm, all right? So we're fascinated by why other people do it, because we do it occasionally. Now, remember when we were talking about the defense mechanisms, I said you have to think of the defense mechanisms like a line down the center of the classroom. And when you're on the side of the line, you're normal. When you're on the other side of the line, you're pathological. Now, most of us walk right along that line throughout the day, occasionally crossing into the pathological side, but we don't stay there. We come back. So we understand what it feels like to be the strange person, okay? The other thing is that these psychiatric disorders bring up unexplained physical symptoms, okay? They bring up irrational fears, they bring up suicidal thoughts, they bring up things that once again stand outside of that normal realm of human experience, but at the same time, there are things that we've experienced. All of us have had psychosomatic moments, all right, where we've had some type of emotional issue in our lives that has manifested itself as a symptomology. You know, the fear of the exam, so we get the butterflies in our stomach. You know, the feelings, nausea. Okay, a lot of us have even experienced irrational fears. Okay, why are we afraid to be alone in a dark house at night? Why are we afraid to look into a mirror in a dark room? Why are we afraid to read a scary novel about ghosts, and then we have to walk home by ourselves after dark, all right? We've all had these irrational fears before that, once again, put us outside that normal realm of human experience, okay? And to a great extent, we know from studies that we've done, a large number of individuals have had suicidal thoughts, have had suicidal ideation. We have thought to ourselves, I'm not saying, well, let me just explain it this way. We all thought to ourselves, what would it be like if I ended my own life? All right, would people miss me? Would people care that I'm even there? Now, for most of us, once again, that line in the middle of the classroom, we quickly jump over from the pathological side back to the normal side. We shake our heads and we go, no, 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 no. Okay? And we return to that normal experience. Okay? Now, some people, they stay over there and they consider suicide. And it becomes a problem when the individual is considering suicide and they actually develop a specific plan and they begin to put that plan into action. Most of us who have thought of suicide, like I said, we know from studies that it's a significant percentage of the population. We quickly jump back over to the normal side, okay, because that's just too far for us to take those actions, okay. So we are fascinated by the exceptional and the unusual and the abnormal. And a lot of what is unusual and abnormal is also manifested in the psychiatric disorders. So to a great extent, we see these things, we see them as strange, and yet we're drawn to them, right? We're trying to understand them in a way that maybe we don't entirely understand. All right, William James there, writer, 1842 to 1910. He said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the norm. And you're going to see this. You're taking oral pathology right now, okay? Or actually taking oral biology. Eventually, you're going to take coursework in pathology. But you'll notice, before you can take the pathology, you take things like oral biology. You take things like the basic sciences. Because you have to understand what is normal before you can understand what is abnormal in terms of the appearance of tissues and teeth and so on and so forth. Well, with the psychiatric disorders, one of the best ways of understanding what is abnormal is to try to get a handle on what is normal, okay? What is that normal behavior? What is it that puts us on the correct side of the line so that we do occasionally cross over to the pathological, but for the most part, we remain on the normal side. So if we can identify that, then we can identify those who have crossed over significantly long enough that we can put a diagnosis with them. But we got to understand that diagnoses of psychiatric disorders are very common. You can see there are 450 million people who suffer from psychological disorders worldwide. Okay, so a very, very large number of individuals. Okay, we know those numbers are going up as medical students, as dental students are increasingly exposed to the behavioral sciences. They become aware of these things such that they're making more and more diagnoses. So in other words, there's probably always been a significantly high rate of psychiatric disorders. It's just that we haven't been aware of them. And now as awareness increases among healthcare professionals, the diagnoses will go up. But that's a good thing because as diagnoses go up, the treatment can go up as well. Okay. Just as a little cross-cultural comparison there, we know that depression and schizophrenia exist in all cultures. Because one of the things that we're going to talk about today from the standpoint of the biopsychosocial model is culturally created. All right. For instance, if you look at the teenage years, you know, we talked about. Remember, one of the constants that we see in developed societies in the teenage years is this idea of rebellion. All right, trying to find oneself. Well, if we look into traditional societies, all right, say we were going to the mountains of Papua New Guinea, for instance, okay, we would find that the teenage years are not necessarily going to be marked by that same rebellion as the teenage years would be in Fiji or the U.S. or Canada or something like that. So the same question becomes whether or not some psychiatric disorders are essentially socially created by the environment around people. Okay, well, if we look at rates of depression and schizophrenia, for example, we see that they do exist in all cultures. So while culture and while social customs will play a role in terms of framing how we look at mental illness, in terms of how we diagnose and treat it, it isn't necessarily going to be that it creates these psychiatric disorders. They exist in and of themselves. They are what we would refer to as organic disorders. Okay. In other words, we can find biochemical evidence of them present. Okay. All right. So if we look back in time, I mentioned already these psychiatric disorders have probably always existed. It's just that over the last 100 years or so, we developed an advanced understanding of their etiology, their treatment, you know, and we've almost humanized the psychiatric disorders. All right. So if you look at ancient treatments, what we used to find was that we would have what we had trepanation. You see that skull there? Basically, you would take someone with a psychiatric disorder, and they would be acting as if they were possessed by evil spirits. All right. And so since our forebears didn't necessarily understand the concept of biochemistry and concept of neurology and neurotransmitters and so on and so forth, they would look for an explanatory model to explain why people were acting outside the normal realm of human experience. And the best that they could sometimes come up with was that they were possessed by evil spirits. So one ancient treatment was to trepan, in order to bore holes in the skull to release the evil spirits that were causing the possession. And you can see we have evidence of that there in that skull. Trepanation has long been practiced not only as a treatment for psychiatric disorders, but as a treatment for brain injury, and it's still used in some extreme forms even now. In 2015, if we have an individual that has a traumatic injury to the brain, a TBI, traumatic brain injury, and all other methods of reducing pressure, such as the use of steroids and so on and so forth, have failed, we actually still will use trepanation. Okay. Other ancient treatments, exorcism. We used to cage people like animals. We used to beat them, try to beat the psychiatric disorder out of them, burn them, castrate them, mutilate them, transfuse them with animal blood. All with the idea, remember, we look at these things and we go, oh my gosh, how awful. Okay? But it was all with the idea that they didn't understand what was wrong with the patient, so they were trying to come up with the best treatment that they had available. 100 years from now, science will probably look back at the way we treat people in 2015 and they'll go, what barbarians those individuals were. Okay? All right, so I mentioned that psychological and psychiatric disorders are said to be increasing in society, and I already gave you the answer to this. Well, yeah, they are increasing, probably for a number of reasons. Probably because we are now more aware of them, so we're diagnosing ones that were always there, and so hence it looks like the numbers go up. Okay, but there's also a school of thought that would suggest that because of the nature of modern society in which there's an extreme amount of stress, all right? We're surrounded by large cities and honking horns and demands on our personal time. That in and of itself is also leading to increasing rates of psychiatric disorders as well. All right, so let's jump ahead. Let's get to the side of the medical model, because I've alluded to this idea that we're only in about the last 100 years, or maybe even really in the past 50 years, that we have medicalized the idea of the psychiatric disorders, that they're actually caused by medical conditions that can be identified and hence treated. All right. So Philip Pinel, all right, 1745 to 1826. Remember, it's not a history class, so don't memorize the names or the dates or anything. He was a French physician. He insisted the madness was due not demonic possession, but essentially to an ailment of the mind. All right, because the previous model, like we discussed, was this idea that you were simply possessed. All right, and that we have these various treatments like trepanation to get rid of the evil spirits. And so what we used to do with these individuals, when we found that, boring holes in their skulls and beating them and mutilating them was not effective, is we simply locked them away in madhouses, in insane asylums. And basically these individuals were left to live their lives there because there simply was not good treatment. But because they were bothersome to society, they were strange, they were outside that realm of normal experience, we wanted them locked away. So we've got this wonderful artistic piece called Dance at the Madhouse, where these people are essentially left to live their own lives in their form of insanity. By the way, insanity is not a medical term, it's a legal term. We don't say insanity in medicine. All right, so if we could now take the medical model and we could ask ourselves, how can we place this into, how can we quantify this, in other words? How can we break it down into its constituent parts? Well, the medical model is the way that we look at all types of illness, right? Not just mental illness, but we actually have the advances that were made in psychiatric care to thank for this medical model, right? And you could equally say that it's the dental model as well, and it basically comes in 4 different steps. First of all, we have this idea that disease must have an etiology, all right? In other words, etiology refers to what is the cause, all right? How does disorder develop, okay? In other words, if you were to look at teeth caries, all right, how do caries develop? Well, caries develop because of poor choices in diet and poor choices in preventative dental care, all right? So that would be the etiology of caries, all right? Well, if we know how something is caused, then obviously we can diagnose it, all right? And to diagnose things, we have to put a set of symptoms, or how do we distinguish one particular disease from another? Well, we come up with a list of A, B, C. These are the things that are going to be present in the specific disorder, okay? And like I said, once we codify those things, then a diagnosis of schizophrenia in Fiji is going to be the same as a diagnosis of schizophrenia in Germany, for instance. Okay, so we need to have the ability to not only understand the cause of the disorder, but we need to have a delineating set of symptomologies that allows us to give it a diagnosis. Well, if we can do that, and we understand the cause and diagnosis, then in theory, we can treat the disorder, all right? So with the psychiatric things, we can either treat it in the inpatient psychiatric setting, or we can treat it in the outpatient setting if that is applicable, okay? And then the final stage in the medical model that would help all this is the idea of a prognosis, simply a forecast about the disorder. So in other words, our prognosis is what do we anticipate will be a likely outcome for a specific patient. All right. Really, there's only a couple of different prognoses. Either the patient's going to get better and make a full or partial recovery, or the patient's ultimate disposition is going to be death. All right. And then once again, there we just want to be reminded of the biopsychosocial model that we talked so much about in the class. Remember this idea: there's biological, psychological, and then there's also sociocultural influence that lead to the psychological as well as other disorders. So just a quick reminder. All right, so you remember one of the things that we talked about just previously here was under the medical model is that we wanted to classify diseases. So we give them names, and so we can differentiate them from other diseases, all right? Within the realm of the psychiatric disorders, the means by which we classify things is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. Okay, is essentially the Bible of mental health. Now, we're up to, we have a DSM-4 as mentioned here, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 4th edition, okay, was revised in 2000. In the DSM-4, there's roughly 400 psychiatric disorders, compared to only 60 in the original DSM-4 that was printed in the 1950s. Why such a huge change in numbers? Well, we discovered new diseases. Okay, not that the diseases weren't always there, but we've discovered the ability to lump symptoms together in such a way that we've created disorders. Okay, and when we create disorders, remember, according to the medical model, that gives us the ability to differentiate them and hence to treat these individuals. Okay, now some people argue that we simply are splitting hairs. All right. That a lot of the disorders that we have today should actually be lumped back together into larger groups. For instance, if we were to look at autism, okay, autism is actually lumped into 3 different things. We have autism spectrum disorders, okay, we have autism itself, all right, and then we have pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and then we actually have Asperger's syndrome. So those 3 ones together become the autism spectrum disorders, okay, hence an increase in the number of different diagnoses that are available in the DSM. Now, actually, within the past 2 years, we have a DSM-5 now. I still have reference there, the DSM-4. Okay, so let's just jump right in here and we'll start talking about our first type of psychiatric disorder, and we'll start out with the anxiety disorders, okay? Anxiety disorders, a generalized definition would be there, a feeling of excessive apprehension and anxiety, okay? We have 5 different ones that we're going to talk about: GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, and like I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to differentiate OCD from obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and then PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? Now, I have the question here: how do you think anxiety disorders are going to differ from ordinary worries and fears we all experience? It's exactly like the coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms. Remember that line down the middle of the classroom, okay? One side of the line is a pathology, the other side is normal, okay? It's the same thing here. One side of the line is normal, the other side is the anxiety disorders, okay? Most of us have ordinary worries. We have fears. That's part of life, okay? But we don't have them consistently all the time and such that they interfere with our ability to function in this life. So in other words, we cross over into the side of the anxiety disorders briefly when we're afraid of our performance in an exam in school, for instance, but then we come back over onto the normal side of the line in most instances, okay? People with an actual diagnosis of one of the anxiety disorders, just like the manner in which the defense mechanisms became a problem, is they spend too much time worrying, all right? And the worries become overwhelming to the extent that they can no longer function in their daily lives.